In these weeks, we have been physically separated, and I have experienced the power of prayer more deeply. Week after week, we've been sharing our prayer requests with the church, regularly hearing the desire for prayer for a loved one, for a neighbor, for a friend of a friend. Even people who don't normally turn to God have expressed a deep gratitude for prayer. Especially in times of uncertainty and threat, prayer, even that might feel incoherent and jumbled, has a way of slowly realigning our lives so that we feel ourselves being drawn in the direction of God's intention. I also confess that during these weeks I have also felt more intensely distracted by everything around me. The constant barrage of news and need to know and news and need to know. Let's see, where was I? What was I just starting to do? Maybe I need to go and get a snack. It sound familiar? It can be hard to pray. I think we sometimes have a sense that there was a time in the past when the pace and the simplicity of life allowed more space and more time for prayer. Somehow easier to place life before God way back then. In our time, with its relentless technology and battering of a pandemic, it makes it harder, so much harder to pray. But then I think, who am I kidding? In the midst of our fears and our anxieties, human beings have always been infinitely distractible and so easily seduced. In the 3rd century, the Desert Fathers felt this so intensely that they took the action of moving away from all the distractions and seductions of their worlds and moving into that dry, spare desert place. They wanted to focus their lives on God, to practice an interior silence and continual prayer. And all of the distractions made it tough. From the very beginning of the church, believers have needed to return to prayer intentionally, again and again. And from the beginning, we have been tempted to turn away from it. But then and now, more than any other practice, prayer enables us to place our lives in God's hands, to have our lives realigned to God's purposes. In our text from Acts, we read that some weeks after the resurrection, Jesus ascended into heaven, and he told his disciples, "You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses." You'll have power to be witnesses, starting right in the center of your world to this ever-widening circle of influence. And Jesus was lifted up and carried out of their sight. So once the disciples were shaken out of looking up into the heavens, what did they do? They went back to Jerusalem. All of them. And Acts tells us they were constantly devoting themselves to prayer, together with certain women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well as his brothers. Did you hear what they did? Besides go back to Jerusalem. One writer puts it quite simply, the disciples were persisting in prayer. And so the stage is set, and what follows throughout the book of Acts of the Apostles is just that. It is the Acts of the Apostles. And in this collection of stories, we read the incredible news of how God began to use these men and women to push all of the boundaries in bringing good news to the world. The good news was not just for Jews, it was also for Gentiles. It was not just for men, it was also for women. And today, the same Holy Spirit is calling us forward. There's a stirring sense that God will act among us again and call us again into that good and risky, that unpredictable, boundary-breaking work for the sake of love. But first the disciples prayed. They persisted in prayer. There was bold and risky work ahead. It takes a lot to break the grip of this old, tired, deathly, enslaving world. The power of the Holy Spirit was about to crack things open, but the disciples also had a role in this. The disciples made themselves ready for God's work. They didn't run away or plot out what God's program should be or sit in despair over their lack of ability for resources to make it come true. They devoted themselves in prayer. They persisted in prayer. One of the people in my life who taught me a great deal about grace and about prayer was my professor, Glenn Henson. One of the notable things that he said about prayer is that the Holy Spirit and prayer go hand in hand. The mission of Jesus Christ and the church has inseparable linkages to both. The Holy Spirit and prayer, hand in hand, that's a powerful image. Jesus' disciples persisted in prayer, gathering strength for the journey ahead. And God knows they would need all the strength they could muster. And generations since their time, they have been given that same power. The power to be witnesses even to the end of the earth. God always has a calling, a purpose, an intention for us, for this church, for your life and mine. It is an intention that is larger, more risky, more faithful than we could possibly imagine on our own. As we persist in prayer and open ourselves up to the power that only God can give us, God promises to use our lives to bring good news to the world. Love, compassion, justice. Beverly Gaventa writes, what the apostles and Luke's readers learn is that God's promises can be trusted. God's promises can be trusted even if God fulfills those promises in astonishing, sometimes even offensive ways. The only way that we get ready for promises like that is to persist in prayer, to seek out the gift of the Holy Spirit, to wait on God, to focus our lives so strongly on God that together we are ready for God's peculiar, risky action and call. Prayer is essential and unavoidable preparation. It is the way by which we wait for God and become ready for what God may do among us. And these early disciples began, by the power of the Holy Spirit, to challenge that reign of power and privilege and wealth and might. They began to break the grip of all that was old and tired and enslaving. They began to enact the world of love, compassion, and justice. It's not yet complete. It is our call today. Maybe some of us are sure that we have already clearly heard God's call, but we think have we heard it? Do we know that the call we have heard and seek to follow is a call we cannot possibly engage without the power of the Spirit of God? Or do we imagine that we can just pull it off, just muster enough of our ingenuity and our own power that's at our hands? Perhaps we need to persist in prayer a bit more, to wait and to ready ourselves to trust God's promises, to be prepared to be astonished. How can we believe that if we persist in prayer that God will give us the power to be witnesses in ways that will astonish us? Because that is what God has already done in the past, and what God has promised to be faithful to us in the future. God will astonish us again. God will act among us again and call us into good, risky, unpredictable action for the sake of love. The only way we will be ready and know this is if we persist in prayer. So keep praying, even when the words feel jumbled, even when you don't trust the intentions of your heart, even when you feel a bit lost or suspect God might not be listening, even when you are so easily distracted that you have to bring yourself back to prayer 10 times in the midst of a minute. Keep persisting in prayer. God will make us ready and give us the strength and the power that we need to be witnesses, to be bearers of good news in this world. Keep persisting in prayer. Amen.